If psychology is a science, many things that books of psychology contain should be excluded from it. One is social imagination. Nature, besides having a mechanical form and wearing a garment of sensible qualities, makes a certain inner music in the beholder's mind, inciting him to enter into other bodies and to fancy the new and profound life which he might lead there, who, as he watched a cat basking in the sun, has not passed into that vigilant eye and felt the leap's potential and that luxurious torpor, who has not attributed some little romance to the passerby, who has not sometimes exchanged places even with things inanimate and drawn some new moral experience from following the movement of stars or of daffodils. All of this is idle musing, or at best poetry, yet our ordinary knowledge of what goes on in men's minds is made of no other stuff. True, we have our own mind to go by, which presumably might be a fair sample of what men's minds are, but unfortunately our notion of ourselves is, of all notions, the most biased and idealistic. If we attribute to other men only such obvious reasoning, sound judgment, just preferences, honest passions, and blameless errors as we discover in ourselves, we should take but an insipid and impractical view of mankind. In fact, we do far better, for what we impute to our fellow men is suggested by their conduct, or by an instant imitation of their gesture and expression. These manifestations, striking us in all their novelty and alien habit, and affecting our interests in all manner of awkward ways, create a notion of our friends' natures which is extremely vivid and seldom extremely flattering. Such romancing has the cogency proper to dramatic poetry. It is persuasive only over the third person who has never had, but has always been about to have, the experience in question. Drawn from the potential in oneself, it describes at best the possible in others. The thoughts of men are incredibly evanescent, merely the foam of their laboring natures, and they doubtless vary much more than our trite classifications allow for. This is what makes passions and fashions, religions and philosophies so hard to conceive when once the trick of them is a little antiquated. Languages are hardly more foreign to one another than are the thoughts uttered in them. We should give men credit for originality at least in their dreams, even if they have little of it to show elsewhere. And as it was discovered but recently that all memories are not furnished with the like material images, but often have no material images whatever, so it may have to be acknowledged that the disparity in men's soliloquies is enormous, and that some races, perhaps, live content without soliloquizing at all. Nevertheless, in describing what happens, or in enforcing a given view of things, we constantly refer to universal experience as if everybody was agreed about what universal experience is, and had personally gathered it all since the days of Adam. In fact, each man has only his own, the remnant saved from his personal acquisitions. On the basis of this, his residual endowment, he has to conceive all nature, with whatever experiences may have fallen there to the lot of others. Universal experience is a comfortable fiction, a distinctly ideal construction, and no fund available for anyone to draw from. Which, of course, is not to deny that tradition and books, in transmitting materially the work of other generations, tend to assimilate us also to their mind. The result of their labors in language, learning, and institutions forms a hothouse in which to force our seedling fancy to a rational growth. But the influence is physical, the environment is material, and its ideal background or significance has to be inferred by us anew, according to our imaginative faculty and habits. Past experience, apart from its monuments, is fled forever out of mortal reach. It is now a figment of the ineffectual truth about what once was. To know it, we must evoke a notion of it within ourselves, starting from its inadequate expressions still extant in the world. This reconstruction is highly speculative, and, as Spinoza noted, better evidence of what we are than of what other men have been. When we appeal to general experience, then what we really have to do with is our interlocutor's power of imagining that experience. For the real experience is dead and ascended into heaven, where it can neither answer nor hear. Our agreements or divergences in this region do not touch science. They concern only friendship and unanimity. All our proofs are, as they say in Spain, pure conversation, and as the purpose and best result can be only to kindle intelligence and propagate an ideal art, the method should be Socratic, genial, literary. In these matters, the alternative to imagination is not science, but sophistry. We may perhaps entangle our friends in their own words and force them, for the moment, to say what they do not mean and what it is not in their natures to think. But the bent bow will spring back, perhaps somewhat sharply, and we will get little thanks for our labor. There will be more profit in taking one another frankly by the arm and walking together along the outskirts of real knowledge, pointing to the material facts which we all can see: nature, the monuments, the texts, the actual ways and institutions of men. And in the presence of such a stimulus, with the contagion of a common interest, the plastic mind will respond of itself to the situation, and we should be helping one another to understand what lies within the range of our fancy, be it in antiquity or in the human heart. That would be a true education, and while the result could not possibly be a science, not even a science of people's states of mind, it would be a deepening of humanity in ourselves and a wholesome knowledge of our ignorance. In what is called psychology, this loose, imaginative method is often pursued, although the field covered may be far narrower. Any generic experience of which a writer pretends to give an exact account must be reconstructed ad hoc. It is not the experience that necessitates the description, but the description that recalls the experience, defining it in a novel way. When La Rochefoucauld says, for instance, that there is something about our friends' troubles that secretly pleases us, many circumstances in our own lives or in other people's lives may suddenly recur to us to illustrate that, après coup, we may be tempted to say, there is a truth. But is it a scientific truth, or is it merely a bit of satire, a ray from a literary flashlight, giving impartial clearness for a moment to certain jumbled memories? If the next day we open a volume of Adam Smith and read that man is naturally benevolent, that he cannot but enact and share the vicissitudes of his fellow creatures, and that another man's imminent danger or visible torment will cause in him a distress little inferior to that felt by the unfortunate sufferer, we should probably think this a truth also, and a more normal and profounder truth than the other. But is it a law? Is it a scientific discovery that can lead us to definite inferences about what will happen, or help us to decompose a single event accurately and without ambiguity into its component forces? Not only is such a thing impossible, but the Scotch philosopher's amiable generalities, perhaps largely applicable to himself and to his friends of the 18th century, may fail altogether to fit an earlier or a later age, and every new shade of brute born into the world will ground a new theory of the moral sentiments. The whole cogency of such psychology, therefore, lies in the ease with which the hearer, on listening to the analysis, recasts something in his own past after that fashion. These endless rival apperceptions regard facts that, until they are referred to their material ground, show no continuity and no precision in their march. The apperception of them consequently, must be doubly arbitrary and unstable, for there is no method in the subject matter, and there is less in the treatment of it. The views, however, are far from equal in value. Some may be more natural, eloquent, enlightening than others. They may serve better the essential purpose of reflection, which is to pick out and bring forward continually out of the past what can have a value for the present. The spiritual life in which this value lies is practical in its associations, because it understands and dominates what touches action, yet it is contemplative in essence, since successful action consists in attempting what you can find yourself achieving. Plan and performance will alike appeal to imagination and be appreciated through it, so that what trains imagination refines the very stuff that life is made of. Science is instrumental in comparison, since the chief advantage that comes of knowing accurately is to be able, with safety, to imagine freely. But when it is science and accurate knowledge that we pursue, we should not be satisfied with literature. When discourse on any subject will be persuasive, it appeals to the interlocutor to think in a certain dynamic fashion, inciting him, not without leading questions, to give shape to his own sentiments. Knowledge of the soul, insight into human nature, and experience are no doubt requisite in such an exercise. Yet this insight is in these cases a vehicle only, an instinctive method, while the result aimed at is agreement on some further matter, conviction, and enthusiasm, rather than psychological information. Thus, if I declare that the storms of winter are not so unkind as benefits forgot, I say something which, if true, has a certain psychological value, for it could be inferred from that assertion that resentment is generally not proportionate to the injury received, but rather to the surprise caused, so that it springs from our own foolishness more than from other people's bad conduct. Yet my observation was not made in the interest of any such inferences. It was made to express an emotion of my own, in hopes of kindling in others a similar emotion. It was a judgment which others were invited to share. There was as little exact science about it as if I had turned it into frank poetry and exclaimed, "Blow, blow, thou winter's wind." Knowledge of human nature might be drawn even from that apostrophe, and a very fine shade of human feeling is surely expressed in it, as Shakespeare utters it. But to pray or to converse is not for that reason the same thing as to pursue science. There is a second constituent of current psychology, which is indeed a science, but not a science of matters of fact. I mean the dialectic of ideas. The character of a father, for example, implies a son, and this relation, involved in the ideas both of son and of father, implies further that the transmitted essence or human nature is shared by both. Every idea, if its logical texture is reflected upon, will open out into a curious world constituted by distinguishing the constituents of that idea more clearly, and making explicit its implicit structure and relations. When an idea has practical intent and is a desire, its dialectic is even more remarkable. If I love a man, I thereby love all those who share whatever makes me love him, and I thereby hate whatever tends to deprive him of his excellence. If it should happen, however, that those who resembled him most in amiability, say by flattering me no less than he did, were precisely his mortal enemies, the logic of my affections will become somewhat involved. I might end either by striving to reconcile the rivals, or by discovering that what I loved was not the man at all, but only an office exercised by him in my regard, which anyone else might also exercise. Spinoza's account of the passions is a beautiful example of dialectical psychology. Beautiful because it shows so clearly the possibilities and impossibilities in such a method. Spinoza began with self-preservation, which was to be the principle of life and the root of all feelings. The violence done to physics appears in this beginning. Self-preservation, taken strictly, is a principle not illustrated in nature, where everything is in flux, and where habits destructive or dangerous to the body are as conspicuous as protective instincts. Physical mechanism requires reproduction, which implies death, and it admits suicide. A man suffered by destiny to maintain for every single unchanged emotion might indeed think out its multifarious implications much in Spinoza's way. It is in that fashion that parties and sects, when somewhat stable, come to define their affinities and to know their friends and enemies all over the universe of discourse. Suppose, for instance, that I feel some titillation on reading a proposition concerning the contrast between Paul's idea of Peter and Peter's idea of himself. A titillation which is accompanied by the idea of Spinoza, its external cause. Now he who loves an effect must proportionately love its cause. And titillation, accompanied by the idea of its external cause, is, Spinoza has proved, what men call love. I therefore find that I love Spinoza. Having got so far, I may consider further, referring to another demonstration in the book, that if someone gives Spinoza joy, Hobbes, for instance, my delight in Spinoza's increased perfection, consequent upon his joy and my love of him, accompanied by the idea of Hobbes, his external cause, constitutes love on my part for the redoubtable Hobbes as well. Thus the periphery of my affections may expand indefinitely, till it includes the infinite, the ultimate external cause of all my titillations. But how these interesting discoveries are interrupted before long by a desire for food, or by an indomitable sense that Hobbes and the infinite are things I do not love, is something that my dialectic cannot deduce. For it was the values radiating from a given impulse, the implications of its instant object, that were being explicated, not at all the natural forces that carry a man through that impulse and beyond it to the next phase of his dream, a phase which, if it continues the former episode, must continue it spontaneously by grace of mechanical forces. When dialectic is thus introduced into psychology, intensive knowledge of the heart is given out for distributive knowledge of events. Such a study, when made by a man of genius, may furnish good spiritual reading, for it will reveal what our passions mean and what sentiments they would lead to if they could remain fixed and dictate all further action. This insight may make us aware of strange inconsistencies in our souls, and seeing how contrary some of our ideals are to others, and how horrible, in some cases, would be their ultimate expression, we may be shocked into setting our house in order, and in trying to understand ourselves, we may actually develop a self that can be understood. Meantime, this inner discipline will not enlighten us about the march of affairs. It will not give us a key to evolution, either in ourselves or in others. Even while we refine our aspirations, the ground they sprang from will be eaten away beneath our feet. Instead of developing yesterday's passion, today may breed quite another in its place. And if, having grown old and set in our mental posture, we are incapable of assuming another, and are condemned to carrying on the dialectic of our early visions into a newborn world, to be a schoolmaster's measuring rod for life's infinite exuberance, we shall find ourselves at once in a foreign country, speaking a language that nobody understands. No destiny is more melancholy than that of the dialectical prophet, who makes more rigid and tyrannous every day a message which every day grows less applicable and less significant. That remaining portion of psychology, which is a science, and a science of matters of fact, is physiological. It belongs to natural history and constitutes the biology of man. Soul which was not originally distinguished from life, is their study in its natural operation in the body and in the world. Psychology then remains what was in Aristotle's De Anima, an ill-developed branch of natural science, pieced out with literary terms and perhaps enriched by occasional dramatic interpretations. The specifically mental or psychic element consists in the feelings which accompanies bodily states and natural situations. This feeling is discovered and distributed at the same time that bodies and other material objects are defined. For when a man begins to decipher permanent and real things, and to understand that they are merely material, he thereby sets apart, in contrast with such external objects, those images and emotions which can no longer enter into the thing's texture. The images and emotions remain, however, attached to those things, for they are refractions of them through bodily organs, or effects of their presence on the will, or passions fixed upon them as their object. In parts of biology which do not deal with man, observers do not hesitate to refer in the same way to the pain, the desire, the intention, which they may occasionally read in an animal's aspect. Darwin, for instance, constantly uses physical language. His birds love one another's plumage, and their aesthetic charms are factors in natural selection. Such little fables do not detract from the scientific value of Darwin's observations, because we see at once what the fables mean. The description keeps close enough to the facts observed for the reader to stop at the latter, rather than at the language in which they are stated. In the natural history of man, such interpretation into mental terms, such microscopic romance, is even easier and more legitimate, because language allows people, perhaps before their feelings are long past, to describe them in terms which are understood, to refer directly to mental experience. The sign's familiarity, to be sure, often hides in these cases a great vagueness and unseizableness in the facts. Yet a beginning in defining distinctly the mental phase of natural situations has been made in those small autobiographies which introspective writers sometimes compose, or which are taken down in hospitals and laboratories from the lips of subjects. What a man under special conditions may say he feels or thinks adds a constituent phase to his natural history, and were these reports exact and extended enough, it would become possible to enumerate the precise sensations and ideas which accompany every state of body and every social situation. This advantage, however, is the source of that confusion and sophistry which distinguish the biology of man from the rest of physics. Attention is there arrested at the mental term, in forgetfulness of the situation which gave it warrant, and an invisible world, composed of those imagined experiences, begins to stalk behind nature, and may even be thought to exist independently. This metaphysical dream may be said to have two stages: the systematic one, which is called idealism, and the incidental one, which pervades ordinary psychology. Insofar as mental facts are uprooted from their basis and deprived of their expressive or spiritual character, in order to be made elements in a dynamic scheme. This battle of feelings, whether with atoms or exclusively with their own cohorts, might be called a primitive materialism, rather than an idealism, if idealism were to retain its Platonic sense. For forms and realizations are taken in the system for substantial elements, and are made to figure either as a part or as the whole of the world's matter. Phenomena, specifically mental, certainly exist, since natural phenomena and ideal truths are concentrated and telescoped in apprehension, besides being weighted with an emotion due to their effect on the person who perceives them. This variation, which reality suffers in being reported to perception, turns the report into mental fact distinguishable from its subject matter. When the immediate flux is partly understood and the natural world has become a constant presence, the whole flux itself, as it flowed originally, comes to be called a mental flux. because its elements and method are seen to differ from the elements and method embodied in material objects or in ideal truth. The permanent phenomena are now called mental because they all deviate from the realities to be ultimately conceived. To call the immediate mental is therefore correct and inevitable when once the ultimate is in view. But if the immediate were all, to call it mental would be unmeaning. Mental facts, moreover, are highly selective, especially does this appear in respect to the dialectical world, which is in itself infinite. While the sum of human logic and mathematics, though too long for most men's patience, is decidedly brief. If we ask ourselves on what principle this selection and foreshortening of logic takes place in the mind, we may perhaps come upon the real bond and the deepest contrast between mind and its environment. The infinity of formal truth is disregarded in human thought when it is irrelevant to practice and to happiness. The infinity of nature is represented there in violent perspective, centering about the body and its interests. The seat and starting point of every mental survey is a brief animal life. A mind seems, then, to be a consciousness of the body's interests, expressed in terms of what affects that body, as if in the babble of nature a man heard only the voices that pronounced his name. A mind is a private view. It is gathered together in proportion as physical sensibility extends its range and makes one stretch of being after another tributary to the animal's life, and in proportion also as the sensibility is integrated, so that every organ in its reaction enlists the resources of every other organ as well. A personal will and intelligence thus arise, and they direct action from within with a force and freedom which are exactly proportionate to the material force within and without the body, which the soul has come to represent. In other words, mind raises to an actual existence that form of material processes, which, had the processes remained wholly material, would have had only ideal or imputed being. As the stars would not have been divided into the signs of the zodiac, but for the fanciful eye of astrologers, automata might arise and be destroyed without any value coming or going. Only a form-loving observer could say that anything fortunate or tragic had occurred, as poets might at the budding or withering of a flower. Some of nature's automata, however, love themselves and comment on the form they achieve or abandon. These constellations of atoms are genuine beasts. Their consciousness and their interest in their own individuality rescues that individuality from the realm of discourse and from having merely imputed limits. That the basis of mind lies in the body's interest rather than in its atoms may seem a doctrine somewhat too poetical for psychology, yet may not poetry, superimposed on material existence and supported by it, be perhaps the key to mind? Such a view hangs well together with the practical and prospective character of consciousness, with its total dependence on the body, its cognitive relevance to the world, and its formal disparity from material being. Mind does not accompany body like a useless and persistent shadow. It is significant and it is intermittent. Much less can it be a link in psychological processes irrelevant to its intent and incompatible with its immaterial essence. Consciousness seems to arise when the body assumes an attitude which, being an attitude, supervenes upon the body's elements and cannot be contained within them. This attitude belongs to the whole body in its significant operation, and the report of this attitude, its expression, requires survey, synthesis, appreciation, things which constitute what we call mentality. This remains, of course, the mentality of that material situation. It is the voice of that particular body in that particular pass. The mind therefore represents its basis, but this basis, being a form of material existence and not matter itself, is neither vainly reduplicated by representation nor used up materially in the process. Representation is far from idle, since it brings to focus those mechanical unities which otherwise would have existed only potentially and at the option of a roving eye. In evoking consciousness, nature makes this delimitation real and unambiguous. There are henceforth actual centers and actual interests in the automatic flux. The flux continues to be automatic, but the representation of it supervening has created values which, being due to imputation, could not exist without being imputed, while at the same time they could not have been imputed without being attached to one object or event rather than to another. Material dramas are thus made moral and raised to an existence of their own by being expressed in what we call the souls of animals and men. A mind is the entelechy of an organic body. Aristotle called the soul the first entelechy of such a body. The first entelechy is what we should call life, since it is possessed by a man asleep. The French I know, but do not use, is in its first entelechy. The French I am actually speaking is in its second. Consciousness is therefore the second, or actualized entelechy in its body. It is a region where from breeds an existence to express it, and destiny becomes important by being felt. Mind adds to being a new and youthful witness, so soon as the constitution of being gives foothold to apperception of its movement, and suffers something in which it is possible to ground an interest. Understanding has to be described in terms of its potential outcome, since the incandescent process itself, as it exists only in transit, will not suffer stable terms to define it. Potentiality is something which each half of reality reproaches the other with. Things are potential to feeling because they are not life, and feelings are potential to science because they elude definition. To understand, therefore, is to know what to do and what to say in the science presence, and this practical knowledge is far deeper than any echo casually awakened in fancy at the same time. Instinctive recognition has those echoes for the most superficial part of its effect. Because I understand what horse means, the word can make me recall some episode in which a horse once figured. This understanding is instinctive and practical, and, if the phrase may be pardoned, it is the body that understands. It is the body, namely, that contains the habit and readiness on which understanding hangs, and the sense of understanding, the instant rejection of whatever clashes and makes nonsense in that context, is but a transcript of the body's education. Actual mind is all above board. It is all speculative, vibrant, the fruit and gift of those menial subterranean processes. Some generative processes may be called psychic, and that they minister to mind and lend it what little continuity it can boast of. But they are not processes in consciousness. Processes in consciousness are aesthetic or dialectical processes, focusing a form rather than ushering in an existence. This placing of mental facts is made easy by the mental facts themselves, since the connection of mind with nature is double, and even when the derivation of a feeling is obscure and we have but to study its meaning, allowing it to tell what it is interested in for a roundabout path to lead us safely back to its natural basis, it is superfluous to ask a third person what circumstances produce hunger. Hunger will lead you unmistakably enough to its point of origin, and its extreme interest in food will not suffer you long to believe that want of nourishment has nothing to do with its cause. And it is not otherwise with higher emotions and ideas. Nothing but sophistry can put us in doubt about what conscience represents. For conscience does not say, square the circle, extinguish mankind so as to stop its sufferings, or steal so as to benefit your heirs. It says, thou shalt not kill, and it also says, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God who brought thee out of the land of Egypt. So that conscience, by its import and incidence, clearly enough declares what it springs from, a social tradition, and what it represents, the interests, real or imaginary, of the community in which you were reared. Where psychology depends on literature, where both its units and its method are poetical, there can be no talk of science. We may as justly, or as absurdly, speak of the spirit of an age or of a religion as of a man's character or a river's god. Particulars in illustration may have good historic warrant, but the unities superimposed are ideal. Such metaphors may be very useful, for a man may ordinarily be trusted to continue his practices and a river its beneficent or disastrous floods. And since those rhetorical forms have no existence in nature, we may continue to frame them as may be most convenient for discourse. Reality is an ambiguous term. What, for instance, is the reality of Napoleon? Is it what a telepathic poet, a complete Browning, might reconstruct? Is it Napoleon's lifelong soliloquy? Or to get at the reality, should we have to add, as scientific psychology would, the conditions under which he lived and their relation to his casual feelings? Obviously, if Napoleon's thoughts had had no reference to the world, we should not be able to recover them. Or, if by chance such thoughts fell some day to our share, we should attribute them to our own mental luxuriance, without suspecting that they had ever visited another genius. Our knowledge of his life, even where it is imaginative, depends upon scientific knowledge for its projection, and his fame and immortality depend on the degree to which his thoughts, being rooted in the structure of the world and pertinent to it, can be rationally reproduced in others and attributed to him. Napoleon's consciousness might perhaps be more justly identified with the truth or reality of him than could that of most people, because he seems to have been unusually cognizant of his environment and master of the forces at work in it and in himself. He understood his causes and function, and knew that he had arisen like all the rest in history, and that he stood for the transmissible force and authority of greater things. Such a consciousness can be known in proportion as we, too, possess knowledge, and is worth the pains, something which could not be said of the absolute sentience of Dick or Harry, which has only material being, brute existence, without relevance to anything, nor understanding of itself. The circumstances, open to science, which surround consciousness, are thus real attributes of a man by which he is truly known and distinguished. Appearances are the qualities of reality, else realities would be without place, time, character, or interrelation. In knowing that Napoleon was a Corsican, a short man with a fine countenance, we actualize appearances only, but these appearances are true of the reality. And if the presumable inner appearances, Napoleon's long soliloquy, were separated from the others, those inner experiences would not belong to Napoleon, or have any home in the noble world. That which physics, with its concomitant psychology, might discover in a man is the sum of what is true about him, seeing that a man is a concretion in existence, the fragment of a world, and not a definition. Appearances define the constituent elements of his reality, which could not be better known than through their means.